There was an issue arose about 18 months ago around the Alberta Energy Regulator, where the CEO was found to have created a consultancy on the side, and there were a number of rules that were broken. And now there's been a paper written about it by Dan McFayden and another colleague of his. And we're going to be talking to Dan about the conclusions that they came to about what happened in this particular instance and some of the ways that the regulator can be improved so it doesn't happen again. So, welcome to the interview, Dan.
Thank you, Markham. Pleasure to be here.
So can you give us a brief overview of the paper, please?
Yeah, the paper is called The Risks to Failures in Regulatory Governance. It's really part of the school's extractive resource governance program. That program provides advice to jurisdictions around the world with respect to good governance practices, with respect to the oil and gas industry, with respect to fiscal regimes, with respect to regulatory regimes, and with respect to public engagement and consultation. And we often refer to the Alberta practices as good practices to follow when we're providing advice and training for those jurisdictions. And as you say, 18 months ago, there was a substantive failure within the Alberta Regulator with respect to governance. And we felt it important to write a paper just describing what had happened, why it happened, and how governments around the world can mitigate against those kinds of risks to their regulatory governances and setting up regulatory agencies. So that was the purpose of the paper. And so we used the AER example as a case study to show the kinds of risks that exist to failures in governance.
Could you give us a brief description of exactly what the controversy was and why the AER CEO at the time was let go?
Yeah, what happened was when, as I said, the AER and its predecessors are both recognized around the world as having very good practices, and throughout its history, it's hosted and helped a number of jurisdictions understand what it does and how it does it. Under the Responsible Energy Development Act, when they created the AER, they decided that they wanted to pursue that and make it more foundational within the AER, that they were best in class. So they created a program called CORE, which was initially a training program for internal staff to train them in best practices in regulation and regulatory governance. What happened was that started to morph into an international organization, which got set up as kind of a sideline to the AER. And it started to morph into a not-for-profit, for-profit consulting organization, which was not within the mandate of the AER. And further, in setting it up, it was determined by the Auditor General and the Public Interest Commissioner, the Ethics Commissioner, that there was misappropriation of resources and funds from the AER. And so that's what led to, eventually the investigations and the resignation / dismissal of the CEO.
Yeah, and as I understand it, it looked like, to those looking at it from the outside, like the CEO and some others kind of had a side hustle going where they were charging clients. Was that the case, or was
yeah, they were doing work. They had a big program in Mexico and some other jurisdictions using AER resources to provide those training programs. Instead of that money flowing back to the AER, they flowed that money into this new not-for-profit organization, which was being set up outside of kind of the AER. And what the long-term objective is eventually that would become arm's length from the AER, and these senior individuals would transform over there and become employees of this new consultancy, not-for-profit organization. It wasn't clear yet what final form it was going to take. It was kind of morphing as the discussions went along, as the world was catching up with it.
So what are the recommendations that your paper makes to avoid these kinds of governance issues?
One of the big issues that was identified was by failure of the board overseeing the AER to have provided due diligence in identifying that this was sort of outside the mandate, that there were inappropriate activities going on. And that was partly because the board chair at the time was seen to be somewhat complicit in making this happen. And so one of our key recommendations is to make sure that the boards of directors of any agency, board, and commission of government are selected based on their core competencies, their experience, and their leadership skills, i.e. their ethical standards. And that should be done through open and transparent recruitment processes. And likewise, the same applies to the selection of the CEO. In fact, even a little more important to focus on the leadership and stewardship and ethical skills of those individuals that are selected. So that's one of the core recommendations, that government should really use open, competitive, transparent processes with very well-defined competency criteria in selecting those individuals.
I can understand why the issue of board governance comes into play here. I mean, that's the job of the board, right? Is to oversee the executive management. Were there specific instances of board not doing its duty? Was it a little? I guess what I'm asking is, was there a too comfortable relationship between the board and the executive management?
There was a too comfortable relationship, I think, identified in the reports between the board chair and the CEO, which subverted a lot of oversight by other board members. In fact, it was over a year went by throughout this process where no reports were given to the board on the status of ICOR, its development. I mean, that's sort of an example of how poorly the board was being informed. And it wasn't asking the right questions, partly because the board chair, I guess, wasn't putting it on the agenda or encouraging any discussion of it. So there was a failure there. The other failure was an internal culture. There were a lot of people very concerned about this happening, but they didn't know what to do. In fact, there was kind of subversion of them raising these concerns. Eventually, one whistleblower developed the courage to go to the government and reveal what was happening. But the report showed that during that process, there was a trend of subversion of the culture within the AER for open and transparent and ethical conduct.
Right. Another point that you raise is the role of self-regulating professional organizations. Yes. Could you explain that, please?
Well, a lot of the senior professionals at the AER were members of the Association of Professional Engineers and Geologists of Alberta, or perhaps the accounting organizations or the bar associations, and we felt that there was an opportunity there, because those are also regulating organizations, and members of those organizations should feel more comfortable going to those organizations with concerns they have when they're being placed in a position that compromises the ethical standards that they're obligated to carry out as professionals under their licensing arrangements under those. So we're just pointing out there were other avenues besides the whistleblower legislation that really people should look to encouraging for when bad things are happening within organizations. There are other ways that people can raise concerns if they're concerned about the whistleblower, because there's often concerns about whistleblower legislation and protection of identity and all of those kinds of things, where these other organizations also have well defined complaint processes that people can follow.
Dan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.